I am Elaine Merritt. For more than 3 years, I held the position of Strategic Expansion Director at Delta Frameworks. Throughout this period, I managed numerous partnerships spanning 3 continents, yet none possessed the significance of my most recent accomplishment. This contract, worth $26 million, represented our organization's largest successful transaction. Our client was Glover Group, an international retail enterprise preparing for a comprehensive transformation of their information systems. Their requirements demanded a partner capable of rapid execution. Our needs included securing a client who could finalize agreements before quarter end. The negotiation process extended beyond most people's expectations. Glover demanded modular oversight, schedule adaptability, and contingency protection. Delta committed to comprehensive solution delivery. Our legal department faced challenges accommodating both requirements. Our development leadership held conflicting views regarding deliverable feasibility. The sales team expanded project scope beyond our operational limits. The discussion split along predictable divisions. I reconstructed the framework independently. I reorganized the proposal into 3 tiers. I established a contingency provision that introduced an alternative third-party pathway in case of system complications. I structured this through a subsidiary entity I had established 2 years prior. I crafted the language to function either within the main contract or as a separate document, based on executive preferences. During finalization, the CEO chose the version excluding the contingency provision. He selected the streamlined option, the more impressive presentation, the framework that seemed comprehensive. The provision went unmentioned thereafter. Nobody inquired whether I had retained it. That morning brought deal completion. By evening, the internal communication was distributed. It acknowledged the participating divisions. It recognized legal, sales, and operations teams. My contribution remained unacknowledged. The announcement described collaborative achievement and interdepartmental coordination. I reviewed it once. I preserved a record. I resumed my duties. Later that evening, a communication reached me via our internal messaging system. It contained no salutation. It offered no explanation. It provided only a location, 19th floor, room B4. I arrived 10 minutes afterward. The room held only the chief technology officer. He remained seated. He offered no chair. He maintained his gaze on the wall while posing one inquiry. Did you retain any iteration of the contingency provision? I remained silent. He acknowledged with a nod, still avoiding eye contact. I departed the room and returned to my workstation. That concluded our final exchange. The following morning, my access credentials became invalid. My inbox displayed no incoming correspondence. My schedule cleared completely. A system notification arrived via text message informing me of my role's restructuring. With immediate effect, I received no conference, no telephone contact, no briefing, no discussion. The organization provided no explanation for their decision. They assumed the project was complete. They presumed I had no remaining contributions to offer. If you remain present, possibly between appointments, perhaps observing your own identity vanish from a project you constructed, leave evidence. Simply indicate your listening location. I understand the experience of watching your involvement in something disappear while the operation continues functioning. I closed the final document I had accessed on the Delta network. Subsequently, I opened a different file. Its name was brief, merely 5 characters, none associated with Delta. I returned to the office the morning following the termination notice. My access card functioned at reception. My elevator permissions remained operational. The lighting on my level had been activated. Nothing in the facility indicated my exclusion. No announcement had been circulated. No internal notice had been issued. Only the computer systems had been modified. Only the quiet had arrived prematurely. My workspace remained undisturbed. The terminal stayed logged in. A white envelope lay at the corner, placed by someone who had opted against including an explanation. I seated myself deliberately. I accessed my inbox. No new appointments appeared, no communications from personnel management, and no transition documentation. The system revealed only one message labeled internal, transmitted by the CEO's office 37 minutes following the text that dismissed me. The subject stated, "Appreciation." The content was concise. It conveyed gratitude for my efforts. It referenced progress, implementation, and coordination. It avoided mentioning the transaction. It omitted reference to the team I had assembled or the procedures I had managed. It expressed thanks while avoiding specificity. That message served not to console me, but to complete administrative requirements. I composed a departure letter that morning. I maintained professional tone and wrote with care. I acknowledged my colleagues for their dedication and investment. I mentioned several projects without identification. I included nothing requiring authorization. I attached no personal materials. I saved it as a draft and closed the application. By noon, my communication platform access had been terminated. I received no formal directive to send closing remarks. I was provided no procedure for conclusion. The letter I had prepared would remain undelivered. Nobody would review it. Nobody would share it. Nobody would respond to it. It would exist within a system that no longer recognized my identity. I rose and began gathering my remaining items. Several colleagues walked past. Some hesitated. Some nodded. One approached closer and whispered that the document had been modified after my submission. She had observed the alteration but remained silent initially. She believed they had eliminated the provision to maintain appearances. She believed they had hoped I would never inquire about it. I expressed gratitude. She didn't linger. Mira arrived from the data analysis level. She positioned a folder on my desk and stepped away. The folder contained a printed copy of the contract. The final page bore markings. The section containing the contingency provision was absent. In its position, a clean line break and an official stamp. She had highlighted it in red. She offered no words as she presented it. She looked at me, then departed. The letter I had written no longer seemed essential. I didn't return the equipment that day. I waited until the building had emptied. I opened a separate laptop and accessed a different platform. The one registered under the identity that never appeared in any corporate directory. The one I had established 2 years earlier. I opened a folder labeled Archive, then selected the draft version I had never submitted. It loaded immediately. The contingency provision appeared exactly as I had authored it. The signature area remained blank. I left it unchanged. I required no signature because someone else had already eliminated it, and I no longer sought permission to participate in the discussion. The folder held only one document. It had resided within that framework for 6 months, untouched, unread, and never recognized by those who had once briefly reviewed it before dismissing it. The file bore no corporate branding, no watermark, no formal distribution record. It had undergone a single legal review during an early risk assessment phase, where it was categorized as optional and excluded from further consideration. However, the provision had been crafted with accuracy. It outlined an alternative implementation route. Should the primary integration experience significant disruption, the client could request a contingency configuration managed by an independent party. The independent party specified in the provision was E&M Insights. The governing structure was clearly defined. The parameters were restricted but legally binding. The language was professional, precise, and understated. The document had never been incorporated into the final agreement. That determination belonged to the executive leadership, but their choice did not eliminate the file. I retained no physical copy. I created no duplicates. I maintained no version control. I simply stored the file under a folder titled Deferred and removed the timestamp information from the visible header. The digital record concluded exactly where I intended. That decision wasn't motivated by vengeance. It was driven by transparency. I had witnessed sufficient documents rewritten during negotiations. I had observed revisions removed without modification history. I had seen contracts returned with signatures, but without consensus. I had no intention of seeking revenge. I intended to remain prepared. The file contained the final clean version of the contingency provision. It was the sole version that included my original structure. The 3-phase implementation plan, the modular verification points, the integrated pause for reauthorization. It had been reviewed once by a legal specialist on the client side who had responded with no concerns. Only a notation. Clean contingency logic. Recommend maintaining on file. I reviewed that comment again. Then I examined the properties section. The file had remained unopened since the day I archived it. Nobody within Delta had sought access. Nobody had attempted deletion because they believed it no longer existed, and they assumed I had complied with their decision. But I had not removed the provision. I had preserved it because I had created it, because it belonged to me. And because certain documents don't require signatures to remain valid, they only need to survive long enough to be recalled by the appropriate person at the critical moment. The initial communication arrived quietly. No urgency marked the subject line.
No escalaste então.
It carried the measured language of a team still attempting to maintain diplomatic relations. It arrived through the same inbox that had previously forwarded demonstration requests and development updates, buried among vendor notifications and phase deployment schedules. It bore a familiar domain, Glover Group, but the sender's name was unfamiliar. She presented herself as a project coordinator assigned to the deployment track for the second phase. Her message was concise. She acknowledged the team for progress achieved during Phase 1. Then, in the fourth paragraph, she posed a single inquiry. She asked whether the integration provision for alternative deployment had been completed or eliminated. She used the term alternative. She used the term documented. She inquired whether the contingency pathway remained accessible under current circumstances. She sought confirmation, not explanation. Her tone implied she already possessed the answer. She was merely verifying whether someone would state it openly within Delta. Nobody responded. The message was designated for internal processing. It was forwarded, redirected, rerouted. Legal transferred it to product forwarded it to compliance elevated it to sales attempted to move it off channel, but nothing progressed beyond the provision. They possessed no copy of the contingency language. The final agreement contained no clause for alternative implementation. There was no signed appendix, no timeline extension procedure, no legal framework for modular oversight. The provision no longer existed in their system, but it had not disappeared. The provision still existed in the client's recollection, and that was its most important location. 2 days later, I received a second communication. It arrived at the official contact address I had established for ENM Insights. The sender identified herself with a Glover domain. Her message was briefer than the first. She thanked me for a previous response that had helped clarify a service definition. She stated the client now required verification that the contingency provision could still be activated. She asked whether the pathway had been assigned to a legal entity. She attached nothing. She signed with her complete name and position. Then she waited. I opened the provision. It appeared as it always had, unmodified, unmonitored, untouched. The formatting remained consistent. The conditions still matched the stage Glover had reached. The provision defined the time frame. The time frame had expired. The alternative pathway had been triggered. I saved the file again, this time with a copy-marked mirror. I generated no new content. I composed no response. I recorded the request, but kept the inbox closed. Within Delta, reactions began to emerge. Someone from compliance reopened the shared document repository. A filtered search query revealed that someone from legal had entered alternative delivery. Someone reactivated an old approval discussion. Screenshots began circulating in private channels. One included a sentence with my initials beside the original draft routing. It was dated 3 months before the deal's completion. I received that image from a former analyst. He wrote nothing except one sentence. They just realized the version they approved was not the version they signed.
I didn't respond.
Later that day, the official request arrived. This time it came through a certified legal address. The client requested formal verification that the contingency provision remained eligible for implementation. They included a statement of purpose, and signed but formatted for application. The letter made no reference to Delta.
No questions. No disputes.
Only an inquiry sent directly to the author of a provision they had not forgotten. The company remained publicly silent, but the quiet within the organization began to change, and for the first time since the announcement was released, they realized that losing authority didn't always occur in a single instant. Sometimes it began with a single provision and concluded with an inquiry they had no authority to answer. The first indication appeared within the dashboard. A minor delay, a missing verification, a stalled transition from one delivery status to another. Nothing concerning, initially. On documentation, The sequence had advanced, but the log revealed something different. The system had halted and remained halted longer than anticipated. An engineer from the technical team identified it as a minor system malfunction. They recorded the problem, created a support ticket, and tried a manual intervention. The instruction failed to execute. A follow-up attempt yielded identical results. The user interface displayed no indication of a damaged connection. It simply ceased providing access. I heard nothing from Delta that particular day. I hadn't anticipated any communication from within the organization. The belief persisted that the system lag could be resolved in-house. The malfunction could be understood. The procedure could be restarted. The integration could be rebuilt using updated authentication. Multiple technical discussions were scheduled. The term incident wasn't mentioned. The word rollback was spoken quietly. Nobody brought up the contingency provision. Nobody spoke my name. Instead, they worked to reconstruct the access route from the beginning. Fresh keys were generated. Authorization levels were modified. Memory caches were purged. They rebuilt pathways that had functioned during the initial phase. The system processed the data. It declined the instructions. The record stayed empty. The session terminated without progress. The team elevated the issue. They involved the system's administrator. He couldn't locate the issue. They reached out to the supplier who managed our deployment framework. The supplier responded that the requested endpoint wasn't associated with Delta. Not any longer. I discovered the escalation through an informal channel. Someone who had remained silent for weeks shared a screenshot of the blocked query. The notification showed no fault identifier, just a text line at the end. Authorization required. External asset. That statement had been embedded in the contingency provision. I had added it as protection. I had configured it to engage only when the primary key pattern failed multiple times within a specified timeframe. They had now failed on 3 occasions. The system had activated the restriction. I reopened the provision. I reviewed Section 4. The pattern remained intact. It contained no instruction to prevent access.
No verier, no terminasten.
The system hadn't rejected their attempts. It had been waiting, and when they couldn't satisfy the condition, it sealed the entrance. They tried redirecting through an older system. The contingency pattern disregarded it. They submitted a help request to E&M. I found that inquiry the next morning. The subject contained no sense of urgency. The message was composed formally. The sender included their position, but not their division. They sought access recovery for the second phase integration point. No background was provided. No provision was mentioned.
I didn't reply.
I stored the message. 3 hours passed before another request arrived, this time from the customer. They had tried to continue. No advancement was achieved. They were getting ready to implement the alternative provision under the terms we had established months before. They inquired whether E&M was prepared to accept the transfer. I examined the message carefully. Then I accessed the provision copy I had labeled mirror. I modified the header. I deleted the word mirror. I substituted it with live within Delta. The system kept cycling. It hadn't malfunctioned. It hadn't broken down. It had executed its programming precisely. It awaited credentials that would never be regenerated, since the sole individual possessing the original key had already departed. The communication started with an apology. It came mid-morning from a Delta legal representative I knew but had never directly contacted. The language stayed professional, yet the timing revealed everything. They had delayed too long. The subject mentioned structural clarification. The content recognized an oversight during construction. They requested a short discussion about continuity rights and provision implementation. They proposed a cooperative approach. There was no reference to the missed pattern. No mention of the refused access. No mention of the quiet that had followed each unsuccessful attempt to manage what they no longer possessed. They presented the message as an offer, but the customer had already acted by the time Delta contacted them. Glover had finished its internal assessment. The compliance division had presented the contingency provision to their outside legal team. The draft had been approved. The provision had been authorized. The reactivation request had been forwarded to E&M. The customer hadn't sought Delta's permission. They had requested E&M's assistance. That was the only notification that counted. I received confirmation at midday. It came through a new contract channel. Clean formatting, fresh tracking number, and a reorganized execution plan titled Phase 2 Contingency Route. The language matched the contingency provision. The legal approval corresponded with the original parameters. The only change was the signature section. The organization name at the end had been altered. Delta Frameworks no longer existed anywhere. I opened the agreement. I reviewed it once. Then I sent a 2-word response. Proceed accordingly. Within Delta, the transformation became apparent that afternoon. Calendar appointments vanished. Project monitoring systems went offline. Senior executives removed their identities from ownership records. Someone from operations contacted an original engineering team member and asked if the contingency provision had been mentioned during project initiation. The response came as one statement. She was instructed to eliminate it. Legal examined the version history once more. They tracked the decision to the final week before completion. They found the line where the provision had been removed. No documentation existed explaining the reason. In a private discussion, someone questioned whether it could be retroactively reinstated. The response arrived 4 minutes afterward. The provision is operational under a different organization. That marked the end of the initiative. No additional messages were transmitted. No more requests were received. The withdrawal, carefully crafted and reserved for the appropriate moment, no longer had anywhere to go. It had been prepared for an entrance that was already sealed. I placed the new agreement in a separate file. I updated the contingency provision label. It no longer needed examination. It no longer needed protection. It had evolved from backup to cornerstone, and they had moved from authority to spectator. I approached the window, held the document with one hand, and placed my thumb on the signature area. The ink hadn't dried yet, but the choice had been made. The calendar item had no title. It showed as a placeholder, a silent box on the display with no details, no schedule, and no owner. It spanned 90 minutes, though everyone understood it would conclude sooner. The attendees included 3 vice presidents, 1 legal director, 2 operations representatives, and Matthew's executive assistant. Nobody withdrew from the list. Nobody added comments. The room was silent upon their arrival. Nobody requested refreshments. Nobody set a computer on the surface. They maintained closed files. Their attention moved cautiously among each other. The wall screen stayed empty. Nobody had new information to share. The quiet that ensued wasn't oppressive. It was vacant. Legal opened the session with an activity overview. The language was careful. The interval between statements was intentional. She verified that the customer had activated the contingency provision. She recognized that the provision hadn't been included in the executed contract. She declared that the provision hadn't been canceled. She used only finished actions, only past forms. Nobody interrupted. The product vice president spoke afterward. He mentioned the provision had been reviewed during early planning. He noted it had been marked by legal for evaluation. He stated it had been eliminated after final revisions. He didn't identify who removed it. He didn't explain why. The operations manager added that the customer had proceeded without needing coordination. That statement remained present for some time. Nobody challenged it. It existed there, uncontested, between the display edge and the table corner, like a verification wrapped in silence. Near the conclusion, Matthew posed one question. Has she been reached? Nobody responded right away. Legal looked at her documentation. She mentioned that a formal request had been sent to E&M. She said no response had been obtained. She didn't use my identity. Matthew asked nothing more. There was no effort to modify the strategy. No declaration of a new plan. No responsibility assignment. Just a slow acknowledgement from one room corner. A closed file in another location. And then the decision to conclude early. The room cleared silently. Later that day, a notice appeared in the organization-wide communication. It announced that leadership would reassess external engagement procedures. It promoted clarity. It stressed alignment. It mentioned nothing about the session. It mentioned no people. It avoided identities, but the silence had been interrupted. And everyone in that room had understood it perfectly. The announcement didn't originate from Delta. It didn't show in our information stream or announcement database. It wasn't shared by the marketing division or pre-approved by compliance. The first indication came through a shared connection and a private note. No headline, no analysis. Just a section from the Glover Group website published quietly under their infrastructure updates, filed under the project category. Most individuals wouldn't notice unless they were searching for it. The update title read Phase 2 Partner Transition. The overview described the scope in measured, careful language. It mentioned a refinement in deployment sequence. It emphasized modular effectiveness. It characterized the change as procedural, smooth, anticipated. The name E&M Insights appeared midway through the text body. No highlighting, no decoration, just a single reference to a new collaborator. There was no Delta mention, no replacement language, no lost terminology, only a signature line at the post bottom next to the title, Authorized Technical Agent. That identity was mine. Within Delta, no public response followed. The update wasn't discussed in leadership channels. It didn't appear in performance reports. Those who knew chose silence. Those who had previously rejected the provision chose not to respond. But someone printed the article. Someone placed the printed copy on the desk outside Matthew's office, and someone quietly eliminated his name from the Phase 2 schedule. I didn't share the article. I didn't mention it in discussions. I didn't reference it during client orientation calls. I concentrated on structure, continuity, delivery. I kept all responses brief. I compared the provision against the new documentation. The language aligned. The scope remained. The system acknowledged the ownership transfer without modification. 2 days afterward, I attended the project workshop. I didn't enter through the main entrance. I didn't occupy the central position. I arrived early, received guest credentials, and sat at the planning table's side where no camera would capture me unless someone expanded the view. I opened a printed copy of the revised agreement. I marked 3 lines. I took no notes. The person seated opposite me had once presented the original platform to the customer. He didn't look up. He concentrated on his display. His hands were stable, but he didn't enter text. When the session started, he shifted 1 seat away. The room filled with subdued energy. Nothing failed. Nothing broke. But the atmosphere around the room center no longer carried significance. It had shifted by the session's end. The facilitator asked for questions. Nobody raised their hand. The meeting concluded with courteous acknowledgement. As people collected their materials, one participant paused before departing. She returned her folder to the table. She opened to the signature section. She examined the name printed at the bottom. Then she looked at me. She remained silent. She only nodded once, as if acknowledging that she now comprehended what the organization had surrendered when it erased my identity. Signatures can be eliminated from presentations. They can be omitted from documentation. They can vanish from official systems and marketing materials. But signatures printed under the correct provision on the correct day, in the correct situation, those cannot be transferred. They must be substituted. And this one had already been approved. They maintained silence for 3 weeks. No public declarations were issued. No recognition appeared in the weekly summaries. They didn't respond to Glover's announcement, nor did they release their own internally. They started referring to the situation as a priority shift. The expression appeared in calendar descriptions and file names. The actual term for what had occurred never appeared in writing. Instead, they attempted to rebuild what remained. They took the original delivery plan framework and inserted new identities. They rewrote feature descriptions. They assigned identical outcomes to different individuals. They developed new graphics, updated presentation templates, and introduced a revised integration stack version under a different title. The provision name didn't appear. The structure stayed similar, but the sequence had changed. They called it a restart. But systems don't restart independently. They build pressure. The problems started quietly. A senior client requested documentation that had already been transferred to Yenem. A partner questioned why the contingency pathway in their contract no longer matched earlier draft references. An operations manager identified a discrepancy between the legal version control system and the technical archive. Delta responded confidently. They reassured, clarified, adjusted. But within those clarifications, there was uncertainty. The contingency provision had become more than language. It had become an inquiry, one that appeared repeatedly, phrased differently but always indicating the same silence. By the second month, that silence became operational. A second client paused phase 2 onboarding. A third initiated an external review. A fourth moved meetings from Monday to indefinite. Their explanations were courteous. Their concerns were technical, but the message stayed clear. Something had changed, and Delta no longer controlled the change. I said nothing, but I observed. At E&M, the scope stayed steady. The clients who had once spoken with careful optimism began speaking directly. They requested timelines. They sought extensions. They confirmed renewals before previous ones expired. I accepted 3 new agreements in 1 week. I received an internal note from Glover's strategy team. They confirmed expansion to 4 additional regions. They included one sentence at the message end. We appreciate how clearly this structure was defined. The tone had shifted. Job positions began to change. Access roles were reassigned. Project monitoring systems disappeared without explanation. An internal performance slide titled Path Forward appeared in one quarterly review. It listed 4 pillars: clarity, control, resilience, and trust. Nobody mentioned the contingency provision. Nobody referenced the contract. But the 4th pillar didn't hold. Delta's Phase 2 roadmap went blank and nobody tried to fill it again. I continued reading. I read every performance summary. I read every mention of delays and redirection. I read statements that didn't use my identity, but described my work with remarkable precision. And I didn't respond to any of them. By quarter's end, E&M had completed 7 deployments, 3 originating from Delta accounts. Each included a provision built from the original logic. Each provision had been modified to fit the new system, but the authorship remained unchanged. I never added my identity to those documents, but the clients did. I logged in one afternoon to monitor a live configuration. The page loaded smoothly. No errors appeared.
No credentials expired.
The infrastructure remained stable. At the bottom of the admin panel beneath the console where audit history resided, a footer displayed one text line, built on the Merit framework. Nobody had requested that line. Nobody had asked my permission. But the client had placed it there anyway because even if the organization had forgotten who built the system had not.